The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Kensington Palace as 10-year-old Prince George walked alongside his protection officer, Detective Inspector Marcus Thompson. The boy's school bag bounced against his back with each step, but his mind wasn't on the upcoming mathematics test. Instead, his curious eyes were fixed on the earpiece that Thompson wore, the small device that connected him to a network of security professionals, whose job was to keep the young prince safe. Thompson had been assigned to Prince George for nearly 2 years now. A veteran of the Metropolitan Police with 15 years of experience, he had protected diplomats, ministers, and even other members of the royal family. But George was different. The boy possessed an unusual combination of intelligence and mischief that kept Thompson constantly alert. While other royal children might be content with their toys and lessons, George seemed genuinely fascinated by the world of security that surrounded him. The fascination had started innocently enough. George would ask questions about the radio codes, wonder aloud about the routes they took to school, and show remarkable memory for the faces of the various officers who rotated through his protection detail. Thompson had initially found the boy's curiosity endearing, even impressive. The prince seemed to understand that these people were there for his safety, and he showed genuine respect for their work. During car rides to royal engagements, George would sit quietly in the back seat, but Thompson could see him in the rearview mirror, watching everything. The boy observed how the advance team communicated, noted the positioning of officers at events, and seemed to catalog every detail of their security procedures. His parents, Prince William and Catherine, were proud of their son's observant nature, often commenting on how mature he seemed for his age. Thompson remembered one particular incident from a few months earlier. They had been attending a children's charity event in London when George had quietly pointed out a man who seemed out of place in the crowd. The boy's observation had been correct. The individual was a photographer trying to get unauthorized pictures. Thompson had been impressed by George's awareness, praising him for his sharp eyes and good instincts. The praise had meant something to George. Thompson could see it in the way the boy's face lit up, how he stood a little taller. From that moment on, George seemed even more engaged with the security processes around him. He began to ask more detailed questions about threat assessment, about how the team decided which routes to take, and about the communication protocols they used. Thompson's colleagues had started to notice George's interest too. During shift changes, they would joke about having a future security expert on their hands. The boy would greet each officer by name, remember personal details about their families, and show genuine interest in their work. It was charming, they all agreed, to see a royal child who appreciated the people tasked with protecting him. But there were moments when Thompson felt a flicker of concern. George's questions were becoming increasingly sophisticated. The boy wanted to know about backup protocols, about what happened when communications failed, about the blind spots in their security arrangements. These weren't the typical questions of a curious child. They showed a deeper understanding of security vulnerabilities that seemed unusual for someone so young. Thompson tried to balance his responses, wanting to encourage George's interest, while maintaining the necessary secrecy around their operations. He would answer some questions but deflect others, always mindful of the sensitive nature of their work. The boy seemed to accept these limitations with good grace, never pushing too hard when Thompson indicated that certain information was classified. The royal family's daily routine provided numerous opportunities for George to observe their security measures. Morning departures for school followed a carefully planned schedule, with officers positioned at specific points along their route. Evening returns involved different procedures, with the team adapting to varying traffic conditions and potential threats. George seemed to absorb all of this information, filing it away in his remarkably sharp memory. During family outings, George would often position himself where he could watch the security team work. At polo matches, he would sit in locations that gave him clear sightlines to the officers positioned around the field. During shopping trips with his mother, he would lag slightly behind, observing how the team managed crowd control and maintained their protective formation around the family. Thompson had noticed that George had an excellent memory for faces and names. The boy could identify officers who had been part of his detail months earlier, remembering not just their names but details about their backgrounds and families. This social skill impressed the entire protection team, who found themselves genuinely fond of the thoughtful young prince. The boy's academic performance remained excellent, and his teachers reported no behavioral concerns. He was popular with his classmates, participated enthusiastically in sports, and maintained the kind of normal childhood experiences that his parents worked hard to provide. But beneath this normalcy, George's fascination with security operations continued to grow. Thompson began to wonder if George might genuinely be interested in a career in security or law enforcement. The boy showed the kind of analytical thinking and attention to detail that would serve him well in such fields. Perhaps this was simply a phase, a natural curiosity about the adult world that surrounded him. Or perhaps it was something more, a genuine calling that would shape his future interests and career choices. As they reached the school gates that morning, Thompson helped George from the car and watched him join his classmates. The boy turned back with his usual polite wave, but Thompson caught something in his expression, a look of calculation that seemed oddly mature. For a moment, Thompson felt an inexplicable unease, though he couldn't quite identify why. George was a good kid after all, and his interest in their work had never caused any real problems. Little did Thompson know that this would be one of the last normal mornings they would share, and that George's innocent curiosity was about to take a turn that would challenge everything Thompson thought he knew about the young prince he had sworn to protect. The first sign that something had changed came during a routine visit to Windsor Castle 3 weeks later. George's family was attending a private dinner with his grandparents, King Charles and Queen Camilla, and the security arrangements were more complex than usual. Multiple protection teams had to coordinate their efforts, creating layers of security around the various family members present. Thompson was positioned in the castle's main corridor when he received an urgent message through his earpiece. Control room reported that someone had accessed the security frequency being used for the evening's operation. The breach lasted only a few seconds before the signal disappeared, but it was long enough to raise serious concerns among the security chiefs. Protocol demanded an immediate investigation. The technical team quickly determined that the unauthorized access had come from within the castle itself, using equipment sophisticated enough to decode their encrypted communications. This was not the work of an amateur or a lucky guess, and someone with detailed knowledge of their systems had deliberately intercepted their radio traffic. George seemed unusually quiet during the drive home that evening. Thompson, still troubled by the communication breach, noticed that the boy kept glancing at the radio equipment in the front of their vehicle. When Thompson asked if everything was all right, George simply nodded and returned to looking out the window. The boy's behavior struck Thompson as odd, but not alarming enough to warrant special attention. The next morning brought more troubling news. Thompson arrived at Kensington Palace to discover that several senior security officials were meeting in the family's private offices. The conversation stopped abruptly when he entered the room, but the serious expressions on his colleagues' faces told him that something significant was happening. Detective Chief Inspector Sarah Williams, Thompson's supervisor, pulled him aside after the meeting. She explained that the communication breach at Windsor was being treated as a serious security incident. Intelligence services were investigating the possibility of foreign interference, and all protection officers were being questioned about their equipment and procedures. Thompson felt a growing unease as Williams described the technical details of the breach. The unauthorized access had demonstrated intimate knowledge of their communication protocols, including frequency changes and encryption methods that were supposed to be known only to authorized personnel. The sophistication of the intrusion suggested either a major intelligence operation or someone with inside access to their systems. During the drive to school that morning, George seemed more talkative than usual. He asked Thompson about the extra meetings and whether everything was all right. Thompson gave vague reassurances, explaining that security reviews were routine parts of their job. George accepted this explanation with his typical mature understanding, but Thompson caught him studying the radio equipment again. The boy's questions took on a different tone over the following days. Instead of asking about general security procedures, George began inquiring about specific technical aspects of their communications. He wanted to know about radio frequencies, about encryption methods, and about how the team coordinated with other security services. Thompson found himself deflecting these questions more frequently, uncomfortable with their increasing technical sophistication. Thompson decided to discuss his concerns with George's parents during their weekly security briefing. Prince William and Catherine listened attentively as he described their son's growing interest in security technology. They seemed pleased rather than concerned, viewing it as evidence of George's intellectual development and his respect for the people who protected their family. Catherine mentioned that George had been asking similar questions at home, showing particular interest in the various devices and equipment he saw around the palace. She had encouraged his curiosity, seeing it as a positive sign that he understood and appreciated the complexity of the security measures that surrounded royal life. The second communication breach occurred during a family visit to a London museum. This time, the unauthorized access lasted longer and demonstrated even more sophisticated knowledge of their procedures. The intruder had not only accessed their primary frequency, but had also attempted to penetrate the backup communication channels used in emergency situations. The security response was immediate and comprehensive. All radio equipment was replaced, new encryption protocols were implemented, and the entire protection team underwent intensive security screenings. Thompson found himself answering detailed questions about his equipment, his procedures, and anyone who might have had access to sensitive information. During this investigation, Thompson began to reflect on George's behavior with new eyes. The boy's remarkable memory for security details, his sophisticated questions, and his intense interest in their technical equipment took on a different significance. Thompson tried to dismiss these thoughts, telling himself that he was being paranoid, but the nagging doubts persisted. George seemed oblivious to the heightened security measures around him. He continued his normal routine of school, family activities, and royal engagements. But Thompson noticed that the boy's questions had become more subtle, less direct. Instead of asking obvious questions about their procedures, George would make casual observations or comments that revealed his deep understanding of their operations. The investigation into the communication breaches intensified when intelligence analysts determined that the unauthorized access had coincided exactly with George's presence at both locations. This correlation could be coincidental, but it was significant enough to warrant closer attention from the security services. Thompson was called into another meeting with his supervisors, this time including representatives from MI5. They asked detailed questions about George's behavior, his access to security equipment, and any unusual incidents Thompson might have observed. The implications of their questions made Thompson deeply uncomfortable, but he answered as honestly as possible. The investigators were particularly interested in George's technical knowledge and his opportunities to observe their procedures. They wanted to know about the boy's daily routine, his interactions with various officers, and his access to different areas of the palaces where they worked. Thompson found himself painting a picture of a highly intelligent child with unusual access to sensitive security information. As the meeting concluded, Thompson realized that George had become a person of interest in the investigation. The idea that a 10-year-old prince could be responsible for sophisticated security breaches seemed absurd, but the evidence was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Thompson left the meeting feeling deeply troubled about the boy he had grown genuinely fond of over the past 2 years. That evening, as Thompson drove George home from a piano lesson, he found himself studying the boy's reflection in the rearview mirror. George appeared completely normal, a well-mannered child engaged in typical 10-year-old activities. But Thompson couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something important, something that would explain the growing suspicions surrounding the young prince. The investigation was about to take a dramatic turn that would challenge everything Thompson thought he knew about security, about loyalty, and about the extraordinary boy whose life he had sworn to protect. The breakthrough in the investigation came from an unexpected source. A maintenance worker at Kensington Palace reported finding sophisticated radio equipment hidden in a storage room near the children's quarters. The equipment was not standard issue for the protection team, and its discovery prompted an immediate search of the entire palace complex. Detective Chief Inspector Williams personally led the search team through George's private areas. They moved carefully through his bedroom, study area, and the playrooms he shared with his siblings. Thompson watched with growing dread as they uncovered a carefully concealed collection of electronic devices that no 10-year-old should have possessed. The equipment was impressive in its sophistication. Hidden behind false panels and inside modified toys were radio scanners, frequency analyzers, and digital recording devices. The technical team estimated that the equipment was worth thousands of pounds and represented professional-grade surveillance technology. Most disturbing of all, several devices showed recent usage patterns that corresponded exactly with the security breaches they had been investigating. Thompson stared at the evidence with a mixture of disbelief and growing understanding. The innocent questions, the keen observations, the remarkable memory for security details, it all made sense now. George had not been simply curious about their work. He had been systematically gathering intelligence about their operations with the skill of a trained operative. The interrogation room at Scotland Yard felt surreal as Thompson sat across from the young prince. George appeared small and vulnerable in the adult-sized furniture, but his eyes held a calm intelligence that seemed far older than his 10 years. 2 child psychologists were present, along with Williams and a representative from the royal household. George initially maintained his innocence with the same polite composure he showed in all social situations. He claimed not to know how the equipment had gotten into his room, suggested that someone else must have placed it there, and expressed surprise at the accusations being made against him. But as the questioning continued, cracks began to appear in his carefully constructed facade. The breakthrough came when Williams presented George with recordings that the hidden equipment had captured. The devices had not only intercepted security communications, but had also recorded conversations between protection officers, meetings with senior officials, and private discussions about security procedures. The recordings clearly showed George's voice asking targeted questions designed to elicit specific information from unsuspecting officers. Faced with this undeniable evidence, George's composure finally cracked. The polite, well-mannered prince disappeared, replaced by someone who seemed much older and more calculating. He looked directly at Williams and asked with startling maturity whether he needed a lawyer present before answering any more questions. The admission, when it finally came, was both shocking and strangely impressive. George calmly explained that he had begun his activities out of genuine curiosity about the security measures that surrounded his family, but what had started as innocent interest had evolved into something much more sophisticated when he discovered his natural aptitude for intelligence gathering. George described how he had gradually learned to exploit the trust and affection of his protection officers. He would ask innocent-seeming questions during car rides, casual conversations during walks, and friendly chats during quiet moments. The officers, fond of the bright young prince, had unknowingly provided him with detailed information about their procedures, equipment, and protocols. The boy had used his allowance and money from birthday gifts to purchase increasingly sophisticated equipment online, using false names and delivery addresses to avoid detection. He had taught himself about radio frequencies, encryption methods, and surveillance techniques through internet research and online forums dedicated to security technology. What made George's activities particularly troubling was their systematic nature. He had not been randomly collecting information, but had been building a comprehensive intelligence picture of royal family security operations. His recordings and notes revealed detailed knowledge of personnel schedules, route planning procedures, threat assessment protocols, and emergency response plans. Thompson listened to George's confession with a growing sense of professional admiration mixed with personal betrayal. The boy had played him perfectly, using their genuine friendship to extract sensitive information while maintaining a facade of innocent curiosity. George had demonstrated tradecraft skills that would have impressed experienced intelligence officers. The investigation revealed that George's activities had gone far beyond passive observation. He had actively tested security measures by creating minor disruptions to see how the team would respond. Missing equipment that had been attributed to administrative errors had actually been deliberately misplaced by George to observe the security protocols for reporting and replacing sensitive materials. Most seriously, George had used his access to family communications to gather intelligence about upcoming royal engagements before they were publicly announced. This advanced knowledge had allowed him to prepare his surveillance equipment and position himself optimally to observe security preparations for these events. The royal household was thrown into crisis by George's activities. Palace officials struggled to understand how a 10-year-old child had managed to compromise their security so thoroughly. The implications extended far beyond the immediate family, as George's intelligence gathering had potentially exposed vulnerabilities that could be exploited by genuine threats to royal security. Prince William and Catherine arrived at Scotland Yard in a state of shock and confusion. They had been told only that George was assisting with a security investigation, and the full scope of their son's activities came as a devastating surprise. Catherine broke down in tears when she saw the evidence, while William struggled to reconcile the boy he knew with the sophisticated operative described in the investigation. Reports George's behavior during the family confrontation revealed yet another layer of his complex personality. He showed genuine remorse for the pain he had caused his parents, but also seemed proud of his technical accomplishments. He tried to explain his actions as a combination of intellectual curiosity and a desire to understand the world of security that surrounded his family. The boy's psychological evaluation revealed an individual with exceptional intelligence and an unusual combination of analytical skills and social manipulation abilities. The psychologist noted that George seemed to understand the seriousness of his actions but appeared to view them primarily as an intellectual challenge rather than a genuine threat to security. As news of the investigation began to leak to senior government officials, questions arose about how to handle such an unprecedented situation. A 10-year-old prince who had demonstrated the skills of a professional intelligence operative presented challenges that no one was prepared to address. Thompson found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about child development, royal security, and his own professional judgment. The boy he had grown fond of over 2 years of close protection had systematically exploited their relationship to compromise the very security measures designed to keep him safe. The full implications of George's activities were still being assessed, but it was already clear that his actions would fundamentally change how royal protection was organized and implemented. The innocent-seeming prince had exposed vulnerabilities in their systems that no one had previously imagined could exist. The news of George's activities sent shockwaves through the highest levels of government. Prime Minister meetings were hastily arranged, and senior officials from MI5, MI6, and the Metropolitan Police found themselves grappling with a security crisis unlike anything in their experience. A member of the royal family, barely 10 years old, had single-handedly exposed fundamental weaknesses in the protection systems that guarded the monarchy. Thompson was placed on immediate administrative leave pending a full investigation into his role in the security breach. The suspension felt like a professional death sentence, even though his supervisors acknowledged that George's manipulation had been extraordinarily sophisticated. Thompson had been targeted by someone with natural intelligence gathering abilities that matched those of trained operatives with years of experience. The media, thankfully, remained unaware of the true nature of the crisis. Palace communications staff worked overtime to maintain the normal public schedule while privately dealing with the chaos that George's revelations had created. Official statements spoke vaguely of routine security reviews and updates to protection procedures, giving no hint of the extraordinary circumstances behind these changes. George himself seemed oddly calm about the situation he had created. During additional interviews with child psychologists and security experts, he demonstrated a clear understanding of the implications of his actions. He could articulate how his intelligence gathering had compromised specific security measures and acknowledged that his activities had potentially endangered his own family's safety. What troubled the experts most was George's apparent lack of malicious intent. He had not been working for foreign agents or seeking to harm the royal family. Instead, he seemed to have been motivated primarily by intellectual curiosity and the thrill of solving complex puzzles. The boy described his activities in terms that suggested he viewed security systems as challenges to be understood and overcome rather than protective measures to be respected. The technical analysis of George's equipment revealed the true scope of his capabilities. The boy had assembled a surveillance system that would have impressed professional intelligence agencies. He had not only intercepted communications, but had also created detailed maps of security camera locations, compiled schedules of officer rotations, and documented the behavioral patterns of his protection team members. Most remarkably, George had begun to anticipate and predict security responses to various scenarios. His notes showed that he had developed a sophisticated understanding of threat assessment procedures and could accurately forecast how his protection team would react to different situations. This predictive capability had allowed him to position himself optimally to gather maximum intelligence. From any given security operation, the royal household brought in external security consultants to conduct a comprehensive review of all protection procedures. These experts were amazed by the thoroughness of George's intelligence collection and the maturity of his analytical approach. One consultant, a former intelligence officer with decades of experience, privately commented that George showed more natural aptitude for the work than many adults he had trained. Prince William struggled to balance his roles as a father and as a future king. He was devastated by the realization that his eldest son had been living a double life, but he also recognized the exceptional intelligence that George's activities had demonstrated. William found himself torn between pride in his son's abilities and horror at how those abilities had been applied. Catherine focused on the psychological aspects of the situation, working closely with child development experts to understand what had motivated George's behavior. She blamed herself for not recognizing the signs of her son's unusual activities and worried about what the discovery meant for George's future development and well-being. The investigation expanded to examine George's interactions with his younger siblings, Princess Charlotte and Prince Louis. There were concerns that he might have involved them in his activities or used them to gather additional intelligence. Fortunately, the inquiry found no evidence that George had compromised his siblings, though he had occasionally used their presence as cover for his own surveillance activities. School officials at George's institution were quietly briefed about the situation and asked to review any unusual behavior or interests they might have observed. Teachers reported that George had shown exceptional interest in technology classes and had asked sophisticated questions about communication systems and computer networks. These academic interests had seemed positive at the time, but took on new significance in light of the investigation. The security implications extended far beyond the immediate royal family. George's intelligence gathering had potentially exposed information about government officials who attended royal events, diplomatic security procedures, and coordination between various law enforcement agencies. Counterintelligence experts had to assess whether any of this information could have been compromised to foreign agents, even inadvertently. Thompson received word that his security clearance was under review and that his career in royal protection was effectively over. The boy he had been hired to protect had systematically exploited their relationship to compromise the very security measures that defined Thompson's professional purpose. The irony was not lost on him that George had succeeded in ways that genuine threats had never managed. The palace explored options for George's future security arrangements. Traditional protection methods had proven inadequate against someone who understood those methods intimately. Security experts found themselves in the unprecedented position of having to protect someone from potential external threats, while also protecting their own operations from that same individual. George's access to sensitive areas and information was severely restricted, while experts debated how to handle his continued presence within royal security perimeters. The boy could not be treated as a conventional security threat, but neither could he be trusted with the kind of access he had previously enjoyed. Finding a middle ground that preserved his status as a family member while acknowledging his intelligence capabilities proved extraordinarily challenging. International intelligence allies were quietly briefed about the situation, as George's activities had potentially exposed coordination procedures between British security services and their foreign counterparts. The diplomatic implications were significant, as other nations had to reassess their own security measures in light of what a 10-year-old had managed to accomplish. The psychological evaluation concluded that George was not suffering from any mental health issues but possessed an unusual combination of high intelligence, strong analytical skills, and limited understanding of appropriate boundaries. The experts recommended comprehensive counseling to help him understand the ethical implications of his actions and to channel his abilities in more constructive directions. As the immediate crisis began to stabilize, attention turned to the long-term implications of George's activities. The boy had demonstrated capabilities that could be extremely valuable if properly directed, but the same skills that had made him an effective intelligence gatherer also made him a permanent security concern for the protection services responsible for his family's safety. The question facing everyone involved was not just how to prevent similar incidents in the future, but how to handle a young prince whose natural abilities had proven to be both extraordinary and extraordinarily dangerous to the very people trying to keep him safe. The decision to remove Thompson from royal protection duties was not taken lightly. Despite acknowledgement that he had been manipulated by someone with exceptional abilities, the security breach had occurred on his watch. The review board concluded that Thompson's emotional attachment to George had compromised his professional judgment, making him vulnerable to the boy's sophisticated manipulation techniques. Thompson's final meeting with George took place in a sterile conference room at Scotland Yard, with multiple observers present, to ensure that no sensitive information could be exchanged. The boy who had once chatted freely with him about school and friends now sat formally across a table, looking smaller than Thompson remembered but somehow more mature at the same time. George surprised everyone by apologizing directly to Thompson. The boy acknowledged that he had taken advantage of their friendship and expressed genuine regret for the impact his actions had had on Thompson's career. But even in his apology, George demonstrated the analytical thinking that had made him so effective as an intelligence gatherer, explaining exactly how he had identified Thompson's emotional vulnerabilities and exploited them. The conversation was both heartbreaking and unsettling. Thompson found himself simultaneously proud of George's intellectual honesty and disturbed by the clinical way the boy could analyze their relationship. It became clear that George had genuinely liked Thompson, while also systematically using him as a source of classified information. Thompson's replacement was Detective Inspector Elena Rodriguez, a specialist in counterintelligence operations with experience in protecting high-value targets from sophisticated threats. Her selection was deliberate. Rodriguez had the skills needed to protect George from external dangers while also protecting security operations from George himself. The new protection arrangements represented a complete transformation of George's security environment. Instead of the relatively informal relationship he had enjoyed with Thompson, George now faced a protection detail that operated with strict professional boundaries. Officers were rotated frequently to prevent the development of personal relationships, and all interactions with George were carefully monitored and documented. George adapted to these changes with remarkable composure. He seemed to understand that his previous behavior had made the new restrictions necessary, and he complied with the security requirements without complaint. However, his compliance was so perfect that it raised new concerns among his handlers about what he might be planning behind his facade of cooperation. The royal family struggled to adjust to their new reality. Family activities that had once been spontaneous now required extensive planning and multiple security reviews. George's presence at royal engagements was carefully managed, with additional personnel assigned specifically to monitor his activities and prevent any unauthorized access to sensitive information. Catherine, worried about the psychological impact of these restrictions on her son's development. George was still a child, despite his exceptional abilities, and she feared that treating him as a potential security threat would cause lasting emotional damage. She advocated for finding ways to channel his intelligence constructively, rather than simply containing it. Educational experts were consulted about modifying George's academic program to better challenge his exceptional intellect while directing his interests away from security-related topics. His school curriculum was enhanced with advanced courses in mathematics, science, and technology, while his access to information about security systems and intelligence operations was carefully controlled. The boy's responses to these educational interventions were mixed. George excelled in his advanced coursework and seemed genuinely interested in subjects like computer programming and engineering. However, educators noticed that he continued to ask subtle questions that suggested ongoing interest in surveillance and security technologies. Rodriguez implemented a sophisticated monitoring system that tracked George's activities, communications, and interests without being overtly intrusive. This system had to balance the need for security with respect for George's privacy and his status as a minor member of the royal family. The technical challenges of monitoring someone with George's demonstrated capabilities were considerable. The international intelligence community continued to grapple with the implications of George's case. Training programs were developed to help security professionals recognize and counter the kind of social engineering techniques that George had employed. The boy had inadvertently become a case study in how human psychology could be exploited to compromise even the most sophisticated security systems. George's relationship with his siblings required careful management to prevent any negative impact on Princess Charlotte and Prince Louis. Child psychologists worked with the family to ensure that the increased security measures around George did not create feelings of fear or suspicion among his brother and sister. The younger children were told only that George's protection arrangements had been updated for his safety. Several months into the new security regime, George made a request that surprised everyone involved in his case. He asked to meet with senior intelligence officials to discuss how his abilities might be channeled constructively in service of his country. The maturity and strategic thinking behind this request impressed even skeptical security experts. The meeting took place under carefully controlled conditions, with George accompanied by his parents and several child advocates. The boy presented a remarkably sophisticated analysis of his own capabilities and suggested that his intelligence gathering skills could be valuable assets if properly directed and supervised. George's proposal was both impressive and concerning. He outlined potential roles he could play in counterintelligence operations, described how his royal status could provide cover for certain types of information gathering, and demonstrated deep understanding of how intelligence services operated. The officials present were amazed by his strategic thinking but also troubled by his continued focus on intelligence work. The psychological evaluation of George's proposal revealed important insights into his motivations. The boy was not primarily seeking excitement or adventure, but rather intellectual challenge and a sense of purpose. His activities had been driven by a need to apply his exceptional analytical abilities to complex problems, and traditional academic pursuits had not provided sufficient stimulation. Rodriguez observed that George's behavior had stabilized under the new security arrangements, but noted that he continued to test boundaries in subtle ways. The boy seemed to be gathering information about his new protection procedures, though he was more careful and discreet than he had been with Thompson. This ongoing intelligence-gathering behavior suggested that fundamental aspects of George's personality had not changed. The palace faced difficult decisions about George's future public role as he matured. Traditional royal duties would require him to interact with government officials, foreign dignitaries, and security personnel in ways that could provide opportunities for intelligence gathering. Balancing his ceremonial responsibilities with security concerns would require unprecedented planning and oversight. As George approached his 11th birthday, the long-term implications of his case became clearer. The boy had demonstrated abilities that could be extraordinarily valuable to his country if properly channeled, but the same abilities made him a permanent security consideration for the protection services responsible for his family's safety. Finding a path forward that served both George's interests and national security requirements would require wisdom, patience, and innovative thinking from everyone involved in his extraordinary case. 6 months after Thompson's removal from royal protection duties, the full impact of George's case had rippled through every level of royal security operations. New protocols had been implemented, training programs had been revised, and the entire approach to protecting the royal family had been fundamentally transformed. The boy, who had started as an curious observer, had inadvertently revolutionized royal security practices. Thompson found himself in an unexpected position. Rather than being dismissed from service entirely, he had been reassigned to a new role within the security services, helping to develop training programs based on the lessons learned from George's case. His intimate experience of being manipulated by such a sophisticated operator made him uniquely qualified to teach other officers how to recognize and counter similar techniques. The training programs that Thompson helped develop became highly sought after throughout the international intelligence community. The case study of how a 10-year-old had systematically compromised royal security became required reading for protection officers around the world. Thompson's personal experience provided invaluable insights into the psychological aspects of social engineering and the dangers of emotional involvement with protected individuals. George's educational journey took an interesting turn when several universities expressed interest in developing specialized programs for intellectually exceptional children. His case had highlighted the challenges of educating individuals with intelligence capabilities far beyond their chronological age, particularly when those capabilities included skills that could be misused without proper guidance. The boy himself seemed to thrive under his new educational arrangements. Advanced coursework in mathematics, computer science, and engineering provided the intellectual stimulation he had been seeking through his intelligence activities. His teachers reported that George showed the same systematic approach to academic challenges that he had previously applied to compromising security systems. Rodriguez's protection methods proved effective in managing George while maintaining his security. Her background in counterintelligence operations had prepared her for the unique challenges of protecting someone who possessed many of the skills typically associated with professional operatives. The formal boundaries she maintained prevented the development of personal relationships that could be exploited for information gathering. The royal family gradually adapted to their new security reality. Prince William and Catherine worked closely with child psychologists to ensure that George's exceptional abilities were channeled constructively while maintaining his emotional well-being. They recognized that their son's intelligence was both a gift and a responsibility that required careful management. George's relationship with his siblings stabilized as the family learned to navigate their changed circumstances. Princess Charlotte and Prince Louis were largely unaware of the specific reasons for the increased security measures, viewing them simply as part of their normal royal lifestyle. George showed genuine care for his younger siblings and demonstrated no inclination to involve them in any inappropriate activities. The international implications of George's case continued to evolve as intelligence services around the world examined their own vulnerabilities to similar exploits. Several nations quietly updated their protection procedures for high-value individuals, recognizing that traditional security measures had not anticipated threats from within the protected families themselves. A year after the initial discovery of George's activities, he was invited to participate in a carefully supervised research project examining intelligence and security from academic perspectives. The project, conducted by a consortium of universities and overseen by security professionals, allowed George to apply his analytical abilities to theoretical problems rather than real security systems. The research project proved beneficial for everyone involved. George gained an appropriate outlet for his intelligence interests while contributing to legitimate academic understanding of security vulnerabilities. The researchers were impressed by his ability to identify weaknesses in theoretical security scenarios and propose innovative solutions to complex problems. Thompson watched George's progress with mixed feelings. He remained proud of the boy's intellectual achievements while also feeling responsible for not recognizing the warning signs of his intelligence activities earlier. The training programs Thompson developed included extensive sections on recognizing exceptional intelligence in protected individuals and managing the unique challenges such capabilities presented. George's public appearances became carefully choreographed events that balanced his royal duties with security requirements. Palace officials worked closely with event organizers to ensure that George's interactions with government officials and foreign dignitaries were monitored without being obvious. The boy handled these restrictions with remarkable maturity, understanding that his previous actions had made such precautions necessary. The psychological evaluations of George continued to show positive development. His counselors reported that he had gained a better understanding of appropriate boundaries and seemed genuinely committed to using his abilities constructively. However, they also noted that his fundamental personality traits, high intelligence, analytical thinking, and strong curiosity about complex systems, remained unchanged. Rodriguez observed that George had developed more sophisticated social skills during his time under the new protection arrangements. He had learned to interact appropriately with security personnel while maintaining professional boundaries. This development was seen as positive, though some experts worried that George was simply becoming better at concealing his true interests and activities. The royal household implemented new policies for managing information security around all family members, recognizing that George's case had exposed vulnerabilities that could potentially affect other royals as well. These policies included regular security awareness training for palace staff and improved procedures for handling sensitive information in family. environments. George's academic achievements continued to impress his educators. He excelled in advanced mathematics and showed particular aptitude for computer programming and systems analysis. His teachers carefully guided his interest toward constructive applications while monitoring for any signs of inappropriate curiosity about security systems. As George approached his 12th birthday, discussions began about his future role within the royal family and his potential career paths. His demonstrated intelligence capabilities opened possibilities for contributions to national service, but these opportunities had to be balanced against ongoing security concerns and his need for normal childhood development. The case had profound implications for how intelligence services approach the protection of high-value families worldwide. George had proven that threats could emerge from within protected circles in ways that traditional security measures had never anticipated. His case became a turning point in understanding the psychology of intelligence, gathering and the importance of considering all potential sources of compromise. Thompson's career took an unexpected positive turn as his expertise in George's case made him a sought-after consultant for international security organizations. He traveled widely, sharing the lessons learned from his experience and helping other protection services develop more sophisticated approaches to identifying and managing similar challenges. The media remained largely unaware of the full scope of George's activities, though occasional speculation about enhanced security measures around the young prince appeared in tabloid publications. Palace communications staff successfully maintained the fiction that all changes were routine security updates, protecting both George's privacy and national security interests. George's relationship with his parents evolved as he matured under the new circumstances. Prince William and Catherine worked to balance their roles as loving parents with their responsibilities to ensure that their son's exceptional abilities were properly managed. Family therapy sessions helped all of them navigate the complex emotions surrounding George's case. The boy himself seemed to have found peace with his situation. He no longer showed signs of the restless intelligence that had driven his original surveillance activities. Instead, he appeared focused on his academic pursuits and his legitimate contributions to security research. Whether this represented genuine satisfaction or simply better concealment of his true interests remained a subject of ongoing assessment. Rodriguez noted that George had become an exemplary protected individual who followed security protocols precisely and maintained appropriate relationships with his protection team. This behavior was exactly what the security services hoped to see, though some experts remained cautious about accepting it at face value given George's demonstrated abilities at deception and manipulation. The international intelligence community continued to study George's case as an example of how traditional assumptions about threats and vulnerabilities could be challenged by unexpected circumstances. His story became required reading in intelligence training programs worldwide, serving as a reminder that the most sophisticated security systems could be compromised by sources that seemed completely benign.